And I always believed in the democratization of audio, and podcasting allowed that. The government doesn't have a say in it. No one has a say in it. You can say whatever you want, and there's no censorship.
We've heard a lot of advice that is like, you need to launch with 5 episodes. And you have the data, obviously, to prove it as well. You're like 1 to 3, get that feedback with people, build those relationships, right? And those relationships lead to conversations, and those conversations are going to lead to opportunities.
You have to know your audience. You have to know your show. How long is your show? You have a 2-hour long show, a 2-minute open is fine. You have a 10-minute long show, a 2-minute open is not so fine.
The amount of episodes, like how consistent are you? Like that says way more about you as an entrepreneur, as a content creator, than the total downloads that you might have on your show.
You know how you really validate how well your show's doing? And I work for Libsyn. It's not the metrics. It's the feedback, the emails.
We'll definitely bring you on when there's no hurricanes around.
No hurricanes?
Hurricanes.
Good job, fun. Your English today?
It's okay.
Beautiful.
It's okay.
Bellissimo.
We've got some
Hey,
fresh new
I'm
young
Luis.
talent
And
doing some
I'm
things that I know
Luis.
you haven't
And you're
heard
listening to the
before.
Content is Profit podcast.
Guys, welcome back officially. What are we talking about today?
Guys, today we're talking about the state of podcasting, and we're gonna debunk some myth. We're gonna dive into some data. We're gonna also, I would love to hear some punchy opinions. We're gonna go for all of it.
Punchy
Yeah,
opinions.
we're gonna go for all of it.
Are those
today.
coming from you, from the guests,
From everybody.
from me, from everybody?
Yeah.
All right, get ready. Get the punching bag ready. Guys, if you're enjoying this show, go ahead and follow it in your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, find us on social media at BizBrosCo. Go send us a message. Be like, what's up, Luis? How you doing?
Just like that.
Just like that.
And if today's guests help you move one step closer towards your goal, please don't forget to share this episode. And of course, leave a 5-star review.
So, we have the legendary podcaster here with us today, who we know thanks to this Content is Profit legend himself, John Lee Dumas, aka the Entrepreneur on Fire.
That's right. We'll tell that story here in a second. But he's one of the top guns at Libsyn, one of the biggest podcasting companies, and has recorded over 1,000 episodes. Wow. AKA experience, baby.
Check this out. He's a member of the Podcast Hall of Fame, launched the first podcast about podcasting, and launched podcasts for Tim Ferriss and Jack Welch.
He's like the OG of OGs.
The OG
Just
of the
saying.
OGs.
That's right. That's what we call Epico.
Epico.
Please welcome the newly claimed by us godfather of podcasting, Ross Walch.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for the great intro.
You're like, oh my gosh, what did I, do?
What did I get into?
Why did I accept this invitation?
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Rob, it's an honor having you here. We actually learned about you, like we said in the intro, through John, right? John Lee Dumas, JLD. We were at Podcast Movement 2022.
Yeah.
And he said, if you attend only one talk in this event, has to be yours, right? It has to be Rob's. He's like, come with me, guys. This guy is the real deal. He's like, I make sure every Podcast Movement I come to, I never miss his session. And we went and we got our minds blown. It was absolutely amazing.
Jaw was dropping, all the time. It was hurting after. It was like, what's going on?
Yeah, but unfortunately for Podcast Movement 2023, we actually got to the event after your talk, and I was so bummed. So we're like, we need to have Rob on the podcast. We need to talk about his presentation and, all things podcasting. So we're just excited to have you on.
Yeah, it was a fun session this year. I always, for those that don't know, the session is called Yes, That Marketing Advice for Your Podcast is BS. And this was the 2023. But ironically, I've been to every Podcast Movement, and the very first one, I did it, the same basic session, but I titled it like Dispelling Myths for Your Podcast, Marketing Myths for Your Podcast, or something really boring. Nobody showed. No one showed. So I was like, I can make it more edgy title. And
some punchy. I like it. Punchy. We actually, I think that's a good thing to circle back later on, which is the power of hooks and maybe the value of hooks in podcasting, right? Mm-hmm. But to get started, I would like to know a little bit of your personal story. You have a huge experience, right? And I got your slide deck from the presentation here in front of me. And, you've been pretty much podcasting since podcast started, right? Like in 2004.
19 years ago. Yeah, I started in the fall of 2004. And there was nothing. I mean, I remember I read this article in Engadget, and it was like October 6, 2004, and it said, hey, if you want a podcast, just add this enclosure tag to your RSS feed, and you can be podcasting. And I went, what's an enclosure tag? What's So I was like, okay, let me look into this. And I said, oh, there must be a tutorial around. Zero. There was no tutorials. I mean, that was literally the only tutorial was that horrible little article from Engadget.
That's fun. I mean, they basically call the people that invented podcasting. They called you and be like, "Rob, how do we do podcasting?" Type of deal. Is that what happened?
It was pretty bad. That again, you had to be a blogger. You had to know blogging. You had to know how to hand code an RSS feed at that point. And I said, well, I'm going to make a podcast and a website about how to do this. And that was Podcast 411, and that launched in 2004. And I've been in the podcasting space. Based 19 years. I've actually been full-time in podcasting since April 1st, 2005. That was when I quit my day job and started podcasting full-time.
Wow. Quick, something real quick here.
There's a section in the show, just so you know, Rob, it's called Fancy Hug the Mic. And that's pretty much the whole show. So, if I get a word in, I'll be lucky.
It sounds like you got into it because I'm assuming that is the first podcast about podcasting, right? That we mentioned in the intro. Yeah. And it kind of reminds me of, John Lee Dumas' presentation where he says, I created my own niche. He's like, I was the best podcast and the worst podcast in my own niche, right? And I'm curious, when you started, was that your situation? Like, you were the first one. I'm guessing you were the only one. But how
I was the worst. I don't know. I wouldn't say I was the best in my niche, but I was the only and I was the worst. I mean, my first 30 episodes, you can't even find them online. I took them down. The audio quality was so bad. Wow. I put on my website, if you want this interview, email me and I'll send you a link to it, but I'm not. No, I mean, it was in the early days, we were trying to figure out how to record an interview, right? Yeah. Just recording an interview was really difficult. One of the first ones I did was a speakerphone and a little Olympus microphone recorder, recording me talking to a person on a speakerphone. That's how bad it was. Wow. And then I got some help early on from a couple of different people, and figured out how to use mixers and using Skype and a hardware mixer orientation to do the recording so that it was really good quality. Yeah. But it took me a little time to figure that out and get the good quality. Nowadays, you sign up for an account with Libsyn and you got a Connect service. Absolutely. And you can interview, and it's all software based and it works with anything, or you can use Riverside or Squadcast. There's a lot of things available today that were not there 19 years ago.
Yeah, the barrier of entry definitely has decreased massively.
I mean, yesterday is, I think about this. A lot of people that come to the studio, they might be like beginners, right? They might not know the history of podcasting. They just hear, right, whatever conference they're in, whatever industry, like everybody should have a podcast, right? And they come and be like, well, how do we do this? How do we make it happen? Like, and yesterday we had this lady that, with the advancement of technology, out of her laptop, she's running this like top Hispanic news site for stream / thing for like 3 hours. And I was just sitting there. I was like, this is pretty incredible, right? Like the power that, now people have to communicate with others online, whatever tool they use. And, we look back at your story and there's a ton of friction there to be able to actually put something out there that you might feel proud. What kept you going? Like, what was it? Are you like super curious? You thought you saw this as an opportunity? Like, walk me through that thought process in 2004, 2005, 2006.
Yeah, I graduated from UConn with my MBA in the spring of 2004. So up to that point, I was in school. I was working full time and at night doing my MBA. So I had something going. I was just looking for a hobby. I was looking for a hobby to do. And podcasting came around. I was traveling a lot. I was literally on the road 4 out of 5 weeks, traveling all across the world. Literally, I did 180,000 miles in the air in 1 year. Wow! And I was looking at podcasting as simply a hobby first, initially to listen, and then realized I want to do this. I was lucky. Right place, right time. Everything just lined up. And I always believed in the democratization of audio. And to me, podcasting allowed that. It really was nobody, the government doesn't have a say in it. No one has a say in it. You can say whatever you want and there's no censorship. And that to me was key about why I really got into podcasting and got behind it. And again, just realized that there was no technical help for people. And I was like, okay, well, I can figure this stuff out. I'm an engineer, so I'll figure it out and I'll work with others. And we in the early days, it was a nice little community. Back then, Apple wasn't in podcasting. It didn't support it in iTunes. So it was if you really wanted to listen to a podcast, you had to be techie.
Yeah.
You wanted to create a podcast, you had to be really techie. And that's why in the early days, it was mostly tech podcasts and music podcasts.
Yeah.
And podcasters were either musicians or techies because those are the only ones that could figure everything out.
Yeah. I'm curious, to have the foresight, or even if you were thinking about it in that way back then, right on, podcast is going to evolve into something big, right? You mentioned that you had that belief of audio, that I might butcher this word, democratization. Wow, that's a tough one.
Your English is very good looking today,
Yeah, so I'm curious, like that foresight that you had, was that the reason why you stick with it for so long? Was it just purely enjoyment? You find a hobby that you're like, I can do this?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, I had been in an industry for 16 plus years, and I just, in a matter of 6 months, I said, bye, I'm walking away and I'm going to do this. This is, I'm like, I always get equated to, I went to a trip. I went to India on one of my business trips, and I came back from that trip and I said, this is it. I'm going to do this full time. Because when I was in India, traveling all around the country, I got to see a level of poverty and realized that no matter how bad I might get here, I'm going to be so much better than what I just saw. And I said, I just want to do something that I'm really passionate about. And logic be damned. And I jumped it right in, and I said, I'll figure this out. And I was living in Erie, Pennsylvania, and with my wife, and I said, honey, this is what I want to do. I want to quit my 6-figure income job for this no income thing that I'm passionate about. And she just said, can we move from Erie? And I said, yeah. She's I'm all for it. And so she was tired of Erie winter, and she's like, we can get out of here. Boom. Yeah. So we moved from Erie back to Kansas City, where her parents were and our friends were, and then back to Kansas City we went, and then we were there up until 3 years ago, and now I'm in Nashville. But it really was. I didn't have a good business model. Even having my MBA, I looked through what was my business model on it. It's like, yeah, that's wishful thinking. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm curious, what was that business model? And first of all, so shout out to the wives, that allows you guys to do that thing. And then shout out to my girlfriend. Let's go.
The business model was, well, my wife has a job back in Kansas City, and I'll figure this thing out, and I'll have some consulting clients. Now, I want to mention, I did have a client. I had my first client at that point. And it was Senator John Edwards, who had just run for vice presidency with Kerry. Wow. And I got him assigned as a client. So I had one of the biggest names. I had the biggest name in podcasting as my first client. So there was a little bit of, hey, I can make this work.
Yeah.
Mentality. If I can get him, I can get others.
Yeah.
That's impressive. I mean, how do you go from 0 to? I mean, it was a fairly new space, but still landing, such an important figure. That will give you so much credibility to you and your business, which I'm sure you eventually leveraged to, land some other deals, grow your business, connect with people like Tim Ferriss, Jack Welch, right? Like. That is absolutely amazing. But how do you go from 0 to that person?
It was that I was interviewing him. I saw that he was getting ready to launch a podcast. I heard that he was getting ready to launch the podcast. So I reached out and said, hey, I want to interview you, and I reached out to the people that were running it, and it was just his one of the people on his staff that didn't know what they were doing. And in the middle of the interview, I was talking with Senator Edwards, and he had released one episode at that point. And he said, well, what do you think about the podcast? So this is actually after the interview was over. What do you think of the podcast? And I gave him an honest answer. I said, well, the content's good, but your audio quality is tinny. You're not encoding at the right bit rate. Your RSS feed has issues. And he's like, do you want a job? Would you want to take over this? And I said, absolutely. Yeah. So rather than, that's another thing. Be honest with people, right? If I had said to him, oh, everything's perfect, everything's great, he would have walked away and I wouldn't have had him as a client.
Yeah. And maybe your life would have turned a little bit different,
So many lessons in that story, right? I mean, I feel like nowadays it's still even undervalued maybe or, overlooked the value of having interviews and connecting with people, right? Like the podcast and other collaborative platforms. We don't say just podcasts, but they give you that opportunity to start conversations, which then can lead to great opportunities. And then, like you mentioned, the fact of delivering value up front and being honest. Because a lot of people, I feel like they get intimidated. And I'm one of those at times, We've had big guests on the podcast that I call Mr. Todd, right? I get a little bit intimidated once in a while.
Like, why aren't you calling him Mr. Rod?
So it's, I think that's such a valuable lesson for those listening, especially that want to, maybe they have a service attached to their podcast, like use the platform to connect with people, deliver value, and then eventually explore some more opportunities.
Rob, I'm curious, right? You mentioned your first client, probably like right off the bat. Like for us, like when we started the show, it was like a Hail Mary. We were coming in COVID, like our business was about to shut down because we were serving a lot of local businesses. And like the one online client that we had is like, you guys need a podcast. And we're like, if you say so, let's do it, right? And we started, and then we kind of stumbled upon the building the relationship. And this one person says like, what do you guys do? And we told him on the agency side, and he's like, I need you guys, right? And it was like a light bulb moment for us on that side. And we've had so many conversations where people, obviously, people want to start this and they want to monetize it somehow. We have our point of view on how, people can finance their shows. I'm very interested, like across all these years, right? How is a conversation goes for you? Is there something that you recommend initially for people that they're starting to get into something like this? Long-term versus short form, and go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, well, for someone that's getting ready to start a podcast, I always ask them two questions, and these are the same. By the way, my son, when he's 15 now, Porter, but when he was 5.5, so 10 years ago, it was like almost literally 10 years ago to the month. He came to me and he said, "Dad, I want a podcast," and he was 5.5, and I said, okay, Porter. I go, answer, and I gave him two questions. And this is what I give any client, potential client. And I'll say, if you can answer these two, then you're ready. And it's, I said, well, what do you want to call your podcast? And what's it going to be about? And it's amazing how many people can't answer those two questions. Like, I want a podcast. I read an article. I'm on a podcast. But what are you going to call it? What's it going to be about? Because if you don't know that, you can't start the process. Yeah. And he said to me, he goes, 5.5, he goes, I'm going to call it Porter's Podcast, and I'm going to answer people's questions. So at 5.5, he could figure it out.
That's so cool.
So I always say, people, if you can't answer those two, you can't start. And I have an example right now. There's a guy that's a roofing expert that I did a barter deal with. He came and looked at my roof. There was some issues with it. And he said he wanted to start a podcast. And I said, no problem. I'll help you get it started. I'll get it launched. If you do some work on my roof, I'll do this for you. Just a quick barter deal.
Yeah.
And he said, no problem. He did his stuff. And I go, to get started, you have to answer these two questions. A year later, he still hasn't answered those two questions.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know what he wants to call it, and he's not sure about the format. He knows he wants to do a podcast, and it's kind of going to be about home improvement, but he can't define it, so he hasn't been able to start his podcast.
Yeah. Wow. So, but did he finish the roof? Just in case.
What he needs to do on my side is fine. My wife's like, you need to get. She said to me the other day, it's been like a year. You need to really get back with him. I'm like, Karen, I can't help the guy. Yeah. I gave him what his homework was, which was to answer these questions and get back to me.
I mean, you knew.
I'm here. I'll finish up for him whenever he's ready.
You knew you wanted the roof, and you knew how you wanted the roof, right? So
it wasn't a roof. He actually had to do some looking and inspection and repair. But it's interesting. What we traded for, he gave me his side, and I'm sitting here waiting to do the other side. It's not like
absolutely. It kind of it kind of reminds me of that kind of like saying, or we've maybe heard of some one of our coaches and whatnot, which is like you cannot help people that don't want to be helped, right? And maybe sometimes a lot of people come and they're like, oh, I want to do this, and then when you tell them the next step, they don't follow through, right? And unfortunately, we cannot take action for them. Right, and it seems like maybe that person might be in that position. Hopefully, he comes back with some answers, and it's a good answer and some clarity on his podcast. And I just want also to pinpoint for those listening such a good lesson that is actually, you didn't vocalize this lesson, but I was listening to you answer this question, and I think just breaking it down for people, you started with a little hook. It's like, if you want to start a podcast, you need to answer these 2 questions. And then you went and shared the story about your son. That is such a good format to actually teach people what you want to teach them, right? And when you're in podcasting, clearly you have plenty of experience, but I think it's such a good tip on communication. I just didn't want it to be overlooked by the people listening, right? Like, how can you become a better storyteller? How can you become a better podcaster? That right there is a golden lesson, right? Like, you say your hook, you share a story, and then you attach that story to the lesson. It was amazing.
Yeah. Bro, I love this, right? We had these 2 lovely ladies come in maybe 3 days ago, and the first thing they told me was, we've been thinking about this for 3 years. And I immediately, when they said that, I just smiled, but internally I was like, oh God, here we go. And it was a pretty interesting conversation, but it makes me think, like, how many people are out there that they're thinking about starting to publish, whether that's a podcast, a YouTube channel, content in general, right? Like, for us, we found our home in podcasting. It was like the way that we achieved consistency. Like, we've tried all the other formats, and we fell in love really with this platform, right? But I think those principles really apply to any kind of content, right? And we, on the show, we talk a little bit about that. So I think those 2 questions that you gave us, if people can answer those in whatever platform they want to go to, because a lot of people are like, I want to start a YouTube channel. Perfect. Yeah. What's the channel name, and what are you going to do?
Right. Anybody that's creating content, right? Your podcast, content for product. If you want to create the content, you have to answer those 2 questions.
Yes.
And by the way, that's not the end when you answer those 2. That's just the entry into the beginning of the process.
Yeah.
If you can't answer that, you can't even start the process. There's a whole lot of other stuff you're going to have to do between answering those 2 and getting live. But those 2, in podcasting especially, those 2 are so important, because you can't create the artwork for the show without the title, right? You have to have that. You can't create your first trailer episode. You don't even know if it's going to be one person, interview 2 people, a co-host, what you're going to do. So there's so many things that from answering those 2 that then define the workflow that goes after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that want to learn a little bit more, you guys at Libsyn have an incredible resource, how to start a podcast. When you go to libsyn.com, right there at the forefront, just click it, how to start a podcast. Incredible resource. I have a bookmark on my computer. It's so good, and I go back to it.
You don't need more tabs in your computer. Just saying.
I just bookmark it. I have a bookmark in there. Go back to it once in a while. So I want to invite person listening to go and check it out. I do want to dive into the slides for the presentation, but I do have one more question about your story, and it's about Tim Ferriss. Like, I'm curious, how did that happen, right? And then what happened in there? What were some of the lessons that you took from helping him launch his podcast? For those that don't know Tim Ferriss, he's probably one of the biggest podcasters, I would say, potentially ever. And his show, I think he put it on pause, if I'm not mistaken, but he's doing now a tour. He's touring and guesting in some other people's podcasts, but he's amazing.
Yeah. So when he was getting ready to launch a show, which he launched with Libsyn, he reached out, he was looking for hosting, and I started talking with him. And I'm a Long Islander, he's a Long Islander, so we just connected, talking about Long Island stuff. And he's like, okay, I'm getting ready to do this. And he needed an editor. And I always like to have, even though I work at Libsyn, I always like to have one client on the side, a good name or someone. I just like to keep my fingers in that part of it, working with clients. Yeah. And I was like, well, at that point I didn't have someone else. I was, I can help you and do that editing and whatnot and the format. And so I worked with him and went over the launch strategy. But ultimately, about 10 episodes in, I ultimately fired myself as his editor. I said, first off, Tim, I'm charging you too much. And second, he didn't like editing, and I'm like Mr. Over Edit. So there was a point where he literally, one of the episodes, he smacked the mic with his hand, and I hear this boom. So to edit that out, I had to edit out like a whole little piece. Yeah. And he's like, "What'd you do? What'd you take that out for?" I'm like, "Well, because you smacked the mic." I mean, it wasn't a little smack. It was like, it was like he hit the mic with his whole arm. And I was like, "Okay." And he's like, "No, you got." I'm like, "Oh man, Tim, you got to fire. You got to find someone else." But yeah, he was a great guy. And back in the early days, he was interviewing some really interesting people on psychedelics and this and that stuff. But I still helped consult with him. He would call me up. I remember one time. His podcast launched, and it was at this time, now it's one of the bigger ones out there. It's like 125 at this point, 150,000 an episode. And I had a pretty successful podcast at that point called Today on iPhone, Today on iOS. And I was getting 20,000 downloads an episode. And I was thinking, that's pretty good. But I was plateaued. I couldn't get any higher. And he calls me up, and he's at 125 and 6 times the size of mine. And he goes, "Rob, how do I grow my show?" And he was thinking about it constantly. Wow. Yeah. And I still remember this because I had my son. I still remember the call because thinking, okay, this guy is like one of the biggest ones out there, and he's calling me asking me how to grow a show. And that taught me a couple things. One is never be satisfied. Right? He wasn't satisfied. He wanted to grow. And so I was at swimming lessons with my son, and there was all this stuff going on in the pool. And I just said to him, I go, "Well, Tim, I'm listening to your guests. They're great, but nobody knows who they are really." I go, but even people didn't know who they were. He was still getting good numbers. I go, "Do you have any celebrities that you could, interview that, push the needle?" And he goes, "Well, I'm friends with Governor Schwarzenegger. I could have him on the show." I'm like, yeah, do that. Get him on. So he did, and then he started doing more celebs, and then it really took off. But it was like, okay, I was like, okay, yeah, that comments that just sometimes it's just call in your friends, call in the stuff. I actually, by the way, it's funny. We talked before this interview about, hey, I'm in a studio, and they're outside the door, outside my studio. They're chipping and they're shredding. Yeah. I did an interview with Tim Ferriss. It never got aired because in my old house, I didn't have this set up. So right now people can't hear anything because I'm in a really soundproof room. One of the impetus was that when I did that interview with Tim Ferriss, because for my podcast, the next door neighbor's lawn service showed up. No. And the mowing back and forth. On my desktop, I still have the raw file from Tim Ferriss interview. It's sitting on my desktop just as a reminder. I can't release it. It's that bad. And maybe now with the Adobe software, I could clean it up and get it out there. But this interview is like really old. It's been sitting there forever. But I leave it on my desktop to remind me.
Wow. Send it over. We'll process it for you. Send it over as a gift.
I'm like, I want to listen to that interview so freaking bad. That one on your first 30 episodes that you deleted. If you want to send them over, we promise we won't share it with anybody.
You know what? Given how good the software, the AI software from Adobe is, I should put it through there. Yeah. I should break it up into 2 half-hour segments and upload it and see if Adobe can clean it up. Yeah. And see what it would be fun just to release that so many years later. Absolutely.
I feel like you can put like a little hook disclaimer at the beginning, and say like, hey, this was going on while we recorded, which, I'm kind of impacted, you had the lawn service. Now you have people chirping on the trees while we're recording. Are we going to be the next Tim Ferriss?
Wait a second. In both cases, it was my neighbor. Oh. In both cases, it was my neighbor. I'm my lawn service. I mow my own lawn. I'm one of the few in my neighborhood that does, but I mow my lawn. Today's Friday. I will go out Friday, and when I mow my lawn, I put my noise canceling earphones in, and I listen to All In. So I mow on Friday, so I listen to All In. That's the podcast from my mowing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like, we need to go around the neighborhood, knock on, there's guys, I'm a professional podcaster, I podcast on Fridays. Please move your lawn service. Don't come. Well, now you have the amazing room, so it doesn't matter.
And I bought a riding electric lawnmower just so I could better listen to podcasts while I mow the lawn.
I know.
That's commitment
That's
right
dedication.
I mean,
Yeah,
that sounds like a good. That sounds like a good routine. You know, everybody. You know, we talk to a lot of people, and like people consume content in different ways, right? Like, and think about like how are they gonna listen? How are they listening to you? And you know, for you that's an experience, and for many others is also an experience. You know, you now have obviously video podcasts. So a lot of people have it maybe in the background or watching on YouTube or while they're doing something else, right?
Yeah.
I love Legos, so you know there's like this little Lego station in the kids' playroom that they're playing. I'm doing some Legos, but then I have an iPad with like a video podcast on, right? For example. So I think also as a lesson for people that are planning on doing this, you know, thinking about like how your people are listening to podcasts, you can relate to that. You can talk about that. So I love how you like you literally make an experience out of listening to podcasts, which is great.
Yeah.
You know, and in my session and at this podcast movement, I told people, remember this, you know, there's a lot of talk about video, but audio,
Yes.
there's a lot less competition. And
Yes.
people don't realize, you know, that was one of the big things from the slide deck that I point out, that people hear 5 million podcasts. There's not 5 million podcasts. There's not 4 million. There's not 2.6 million. There's 400,000 podcasts
Yes.
that released new content in the last 90 days and have 10 or more episodes. And you know how many there was in January 1st, 2021? 400,000 podcasts. It has not changed. The number of active podcasts in the last 3 years has remained around 380 to 400,000 that, again, by definition of active, released at least one new episode in the last 90 days and have 10 or more episodes. That's your competition in podcasting.
The opportunity is massive.
So small. Right? That's so small.
Yeah, it's amazing, and to your point, yes, absolutely. You know, audio first, I think, and podcasting. That's the nature of podcasting, right? Like that's how it was born, right? And I think a lot of, I mean, we'll go into your presentation. I'm interested. Like, what are your thoughts in, for example, YouTube getting into podcasting, right? Releasing their podcast playlist. I'm curious about that.
Well, so at Libsyn, we have published into YouTube for 10 years. 12 years actually, where we'll convert your audio to video and automatically upload it to YouTube. If you are doing really, really good, you're getting 1% to 2% consumption at YouTube versus what you get everywhere else.
Yeah.
And there's a couple that have got up in the 5 or 6 percentile range. English is second language ones. I saw one at 10%. But for the most part, YouTube should be looked at not as a consumption medium, but a discovery medium.
Yes.
And that's the reason why we push people there. And again, this comes back to competing audio versus video. When you're trying to compete on video podcasts, now you're competing against 500 million active YouTubers, right? You're competing against Netflix and Hulu, right? You're competing against One Piece live action. You're competing against video. You're competing against live sports, soccer matches. You're not going to win against that right? But in podcasting, you're competing against other audio podcasters for the time of the day where people can't watch video and they're mowing the yard. I can't be watching a video mowing the yard because what would happen to the yard would not be good. Right? The wife would not like that. But I can listen to Jason Calacanis and the crew on All In talk about the latest in VC, you know, the latest news in the VC world, and talk about poker and talk about the economy and other things that are very interesting to me in politics. And while I get the job done, and then my wife's thinking, oh, poor Rob's out there mowing the yard. Boys, go help your dad. I'm like, no,
Go
the
back
longer
in.
I'm out here, the more on my own, the more time I get to listen. And I got a couple podcasts queued up after All In. After I get through All In, then I queue up the other ones.
Yeah.
You're
You're like, this is my sanctuary. Don't take it away from me.
Exactly.
I'm gonna rewind and repeat what you just said about YouTube, because a lot of people are like shiny object, and yes, like consumption versus discovery. I love that change of perspective that you just brought to the show, where it's like, okay, we use it for this, which is great. Like we've seen it in our data, the same thing, right? I would see the people that listen to our show listen for longer, listen more, they repeat, they come back, right? It's higher quality also as well, the type of people that are in different platforms, but also the number one, the competition, right? Like you're competing about all these other channels. By the way, One Piece live action, really good.
It's really good. It's really good.
Yeah. Finally beat Fonzie.
They finally. I mean, I was 50-50 on Cowboy Bebop, but this time Netflix finally nailed the live action.
Really?
They did. Yeah.
Interesting.
I've seen the first two episodes. Really good.
I thought it was just the fans, kind of like raving about it, because they're hardcore fans. But I guess it could be the harshest critics, and if they're saying that, I have to take a look at it.
But anyways, tangent alert, my bad. But absolutely, I mean, I think like that perspective brings it home, right? At the end of the day, is like, okay, well, who's my show about? Like, who's my show about? Like, who am I talking to? Where are they, right? The quality of the listener. How long are they listening to me? That relationship that you build with your listener is incredible. And like over the last couple of years, we've experienced that. We've met people in person that listen to our show. And let me tell you, it's like the most real like experience probably that we've had on the feedback. They know a lot about us. Like and it's a really good and healthy relationship, at least our experience. And then opportunities come out of that as well. So just keep an eye for that. If you're listening right now and you're considering, doing both, like how are you going to frame your distribution inside of your own company, right? How are you going to measure this? And I love discovery versus the consumption side. Yeah. So thank you, Rob, for bringing that.
Yeah, I think it's an important point also when, working with people. It's like, okay, cool, we're going to publish them in these places, obviously based on your resources, your capacity, on what you can do. But at the same time, you're not looking at that data on, okay, like I know for a fact that we're posting on YouTube and there's not going to be, 20, 30% consumption on this episode. But if we're getting eyeballs and people are starting to see content's profit, eventually, if it pops on, their podcasting app, they're going to be like, I've seen these guys before. Maybe let me take a look at it. Or eventually they will want to go and take a look at the content. So I think that's part of the value of, we talk a lot about it, obviously, multi-purposing your content and marketing your content in different platforms. So I think we're already diving into the slides. I think that was a perfect segue into this. And you have a few myths in here that I would love to, obviously, since we missed the presentation, I'm sorry, Rob. I'm sorry. Since we missed the presentation, I would love to hear from you, but also debunk for, some of the listeners in here. The first one that you got is the 5 figures per month, and you have some images in here that says, generate 5 figures per month with your podcast, save today, and you have some price points in there. And I was looking at it, and my mind immediately goes to, this is a service. Somebody's selling a service with a fake promise, but I'm curious on your take.
So this came from, I won't give the name of the conference it was at, but those were screenshots from the guy's slides. And I said to him, can I get your full slide deck? Because so I could have the screenshots to use in the future. But I said to him afterwards, I said, this was like in a January time period. And I remember that it was January presentation. And previous April, I had done a presentation at New Media Expo. This is dating myself. And I said to the guy, I go, were you at my New Media Expo presentation when I did a myths busting presentation? I go, because everything you said was like the opposite of what I said. It was like uncanny how wrong this guy was.
Wow.
In my opinion, right? And the guy, mind you, now remember, he is charging whatever the insane amount was. Like it was like $8,000, and then it was a discount to whatever it was. It even had installment plans. You pay by installment plans of $1,000 installment plans. Wow. And the guy goes to me, he goes, no, I haven't even been podcasting that long. So he hadn't even been podcasting a year, and he's offering up this great advice on how to grow your show, which all the advice was completely wrong. It was all, anyone that knew the space knew like, oh, this is really bad advice. But the problem, what I made the point out in that slide was, look, the value of advice, it's Walch's second law of podcasting. The value of advice is inversely proportional to the price of that advice in the space. And that's what I've found over the years. The people who have the best advice are willing to give it for free.
Yes.
People who have the worst advice tend to be selling it.
Yeah. Interesting.
I like that. That's interesting. That was actually the next slide right after that one. I love that you know them off the top of your head. That is a good speaker.
It's like you did the presentation. Just saying, you did.
And that sets me up. That sets me up for a joke at that point. And then I go, well, of course, if I mention Walch's second law of podcasting, you're wondering, well, what's Walch's first law of podcasting, and that is ego equals download squared. And that is what I found over the years is a lot of times the people, as their downloads go up, their ego goes up exponentially greater.
That is hilarious. Yeah, that I can see that. My brother gets a little cocky out here.
There's
when we
no
go.
way. Okay, no, that's myth number 3. Just saying, so for context.
Myth number 3.
For context, I mean, when we launched the show, we made a commitment.
Yeah.
We're the first 6 months, we're not going to look at data, right?
Yeah, we need to put our content out.
We need to conquer consistency, right? And the commitment was we're going to do 3 shows a week for 6 months at least, and that decision changed everything. We would have looked at what was happening behind the scenes, apart from feedback from the people that were coming to our show, or how we felt about doing this thing. I think it would have stopped and nothing would have changed. I mean, the show brought us so many opportunities, not only in our business, but the people that we met, the relationships, this physical studio today, right? It came from the show. So I encourage people to do that, right? And if we're fixated on metrics, for example, right? That might not be the best.
I have people that will email me at Libsyn, and they'll say, Rob, what's going on with my stats? I'm like, what do you mean? They go, well, they haven't updated in the last 3 hours. and usually at this time of the day, they're here. I'm like, well, you look at your stats every hour? And they're like, yeah. And they go in every hour looking at their stats updating. And I'm like, okay, whoa, time out. I equate looking at your stats almost like when you're on a diet, it should be your reward. You do it once a week after you release your next episode. So if you're going to release an episode, you don't look at the stats for the previous episode until that next episode goes out. So between now, once you release that episode, you go and you look at your stats from the last one, and you don't look at stats again until you get the next episode out. If that's your reward, that's that little bit of Halo Top ice cream with some blueberries on it. That's the reward.
Yeah.
But don't be sitting there every day looking at your stats every hour. You know how you really validate how well your show's doing? And I work for Libsyn. It's not the metrics. It's the feedback, the emails you get. And if you're getting in, and you should be encouraging that. And that's why, that comes back to another, that's not in this year's presentation, but I've said it in previous ones, is what you want to do is when you launch a podcast, launch with 1 episode, maybe 2. You don't want to launch with a lot of episodes. People that launch with 10, we've looked at this, do much worse 6 months later than people that launch with 1, 2, or 3.
So interesting.
And Apple looked at it. They found the number to be 2. We found it to be 1 or 3. Here's why. If you launch with 10, immediately you have no listener feedback, and you've trained the audience that you're not going to have listener feedback. And people want to interact with you. If you launch with 1 on day 1, you can say, please give me feedback. And you are making the audience part of the show. You're telling them that this is a show they can become part of the community in. But when you launch with 10, you have this standoffish, get away from me. I am me. You are you. You are the listener. I am up here. I'm speaking in this mic. I got an FCC license to speak. I have this radio voice, and I don't need your feedback because I can do the whole show myself without any of your feedback, right? You want to be that person? Great. Your audience is going to give you as much love as you just gave them.
Yeah.
And that podcasting, it is a relationship. And honestly, content in general, the content that is not mainstream media, right? Content on I would even say on a social media level, podcasting, it's about just building that relationship, building that community. And I love what you're mentioning right now, because we've heard a lot of advice that is you need to launch with 5 episodes, and maybe their motives are different, right? Maybe they're trying to sell something and they're trying to guide them on, this consume so you can build trust. Again, the more time people spend, that there's this saying, I'm kind of butchering here, I'm just like running off my thoughts, but it's, the more time people spend consuming with you, the higher ticket you can sell them. So you gotta have 5 episodes so they can spend 5 hours with you, and then redirect them to the sales page. And here you are, you've been in here for so many years, right? Almost 2 decades now. And you're like, and you have the data, obviously, to prove it as well. You're like, 1 to 3, get that feedback with people, build those relationships, right? And those relationships lead to conversations, and those conversations are going to lead to opportunities. I love how you're putting it this way.
I want to add a little bit to the data side of things, where it's like, how are we looking at data? Like, what glasses are we putting on? Like, are we putting the glasses of like, how do we study the consumption? Like, what do they like, right? Like, at the end of the day, that's also feedback, right? Like, how long are they staying on? Why is my episode falling off at the end? Like, maybe the conversation might not be valuable anymore. Like, can we reach out to some people? Can we use our social media to establish that connection? Can we learn from that? And on our side, when we joined the Hotspot network, like, part of the feedback immediately was like, we really like the energy of you too. Can you guys do a little bit more solo episodes? And we're like, wait, what? Like, that was never an option. We're like, let's have conversations with other people. That's what we like to do, right? And then we decided to like, okay, let's test that out, see what happens. Well, it turns out that people actually really like those episodes, right? We're like, okay, now we have these questions like, how can we balance that out, right? Like, now we need to like really prepare when we do something, that on our own. And that has been a valuable piece of feedback that we got from that data, right? So it's not looking at data on like, how well am I doing, but it's like, okay, this is a measuring stick on how do we read this data. So what are some best practices, I guess, before Fonzie goes into that you've seen on like, how do we read data, like podcasting data?
Right. So the metrics you're going to get from your hosting company are going to give you a magnitude, how many people are listening, but you're not going to know from any hosting company how long they're listening. That's where Apple Podcasts comes in, right? Apple Podcast has consumption information. And I always tell people, don't look at the magnitude in Apple. Look at the consumption. Where are the people dropping off? And there's 2 important pieces, and you touched on them. And as, where are they not leaving? Mm-hmm. What were you talking about for 15 minutes that your audience percentage did not drop? And then where did they drop? What did you talk about that caused that? And you can see it in the consumption data that where you have an ad read, you can see the drop, because Apple, with people tapping on their AirPods, it skips 30 seconds, drops off, and then it comes back. So I was doing that, and you got to sometimes watch out what you wish for, because I was doing that analysis on my own show, the Today in iOS, when I was running that regular, and I looked at this like 15 minutes of where people were staying and they weren't leaving, and then I was looking where they're dropping off. Where they weren't leaving was when I was playing listener feedback. Where they were leaving was when I was just me talking. And there was one segment that I really loved that I thought my audience loved. Nope, they did not. So I refused to give that segment up. I moved it to the end of the show. Yeah. But it used to be at the beginning of the show, and people were skipping it when I looked at the data. And I was like, wow, that's my favorite part of the show. But the audience didn't think that. The audience really loved the listener feedback. So I rearranged and put some more listener feedback at the beginning and spread it around the show a little bit more. You never know.
It's so interesting. We had the same story with our intro. We used to have a longer intro, and it was like all crafted, different thing.
I'll say today it was pretty long.
Today was a little long, but like the official like intro of the show, like that what makes it out. But it was incredible. Like, we met this lady, and she told us, and then all of a sudden we like started. You know how when you have a kid, right? Fonzie doesn't have kids, but when you're about to have the kid, you see kids everywhere and babies everywhere. That's exactly what happens. Like, she gave us this feedback, and then we started seeing like people telling us the feedback about the intro. And we're like, okay, I guess it needs to change. And we're like, we love that part, right? Because it kind of like got us into like the energy of the show, and we made the compromise. A little bit shorter, but not too short.
I have a. Oh, sorry, go Rob.
I say the intro is one of the slides. I talk about this a little bit more in the presentation, and I talk about how most people consume. I go through a slide where most of the downloads come from. It's Apple Podcasts. Well, if you go into Apple Podcasts and you do a search for a podcast, right? And I'll just do a quick one here. I'm going to do on my phone so I can flip this around, and I do a search, and I'll find a podcast, and I'll find one that I'm not subscribed to. Once you tap on it. And I bring this here, right? this is what you see. This is when you're brought to a screen. See that big button right here? That's what Apple wants you to do. That's what the people are going to do. That's the biggest button on the screen. What is that biggest button? Latest episode.
Yeah.
What that means is the first 30 seconds of your most recent episode is the most important 30 seconds you've ever created for your podcast. Period. Whatever it is, the most recent episode, that first 30 seconds is so important because when people search, find your show, Apple wants them to click on latest episode. They're going to hear that first 30 seconds. What's at the beginning of your podcast? If it's a recanned intro that you use over and over and over, probably not the best.
Yeah.
Think of James Bond movies, right? All the James Bond movies start out with this great action clip at the beginning and it gets you hooked into the show. Yeah. Then they do the intro to the show. Then they get into the main story. Yeah. Do that. Take an audio interview like All In podcast. Right? At the beginning of the All In podcast, you hear a funny quote from somewhere in the episode, something like that. Have that be your intro, or it can be if you have a show where you're going to cover a lot of topics and it's very niche based. Go over the items you're going to be covering in that episode.
Yeah,
so something at the beginning that really is the hook.
Yeah.
For the rest of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And two things.
Before you do the feedback, perfect moment to tell you that Mava told me that your hook notes on the last episode she loved. Just saying.
Let's go. Mava's the producer. Shout out to Mava. We love you. Two things out here. First, you're going to get Rob mad because you're hitting the microphone. We're going to have a lot of mic sounds
I'm not editing your podcast, so I'm fine with it.
Sorry, Mava.
Oh, that was not part of the recording agreement. No, I'm kidding. But the other thing that I want to say is we're circling back to the hooks, right, that we were talking about at the beginning. And lately, I've seen this kind of like trend. And I think the first one I saw it from was Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett. He does this like movie quality trailers for his podcast, and they are amazing. And I remember I wasn't consuming his podcast at all. And I saw one trailer pop on Twitter, and I looked at it, and I was like, I want to listen to this. But I literally stopped what I was doing, right? Picked up my phone, searched for his podcast, subscribe, put an episode on the queue, and I was like, I'm going to listen to this thing. And now every time I see one of his trailers, I'm like, oh, I'm hooked. And now I'm seeing a lot of other episodes doing a lot of those kind of like trailer type of hooks. And again, it reminds me to YouTube, right? And we've talked about Daryl Leaves and, the YouTube formula, and they talked a lot about the retention in the first like 30 seconds, right? And then the retention throughout the episode, which is what you explained, like what are those pieces and what you're doing and talking about there, so you can do more of that. So you mentioned a few kind of like ways to do a hook. I'm curious for maybe people that don't have the capacity or the resources to create this type of trailers, what would be a recommendation for them to, make the most out of the first 30 seconds, the most important part of their whole podcast, the 30 seconds of their latest episode?
Again, I bring it back to what is the show format? How niche? Is it comedy? Is it this or that? If it's comedy, maybe find a really funny clip, maybe even take something out of context, something where the person says, I would never beat my wife with a bat, and you can just have beat my wife with a bat, and something like that. It's just something where you just without the first part of it, that context that really sounded bad.
Yeah.
So you could take something like that if it's a comedy podcast. But if it's something that's more niche based and it's topical, or they're coming to your podcast about the latest news, again, going, hey, on today's episode, we're going to tell you why paper straws really suck, and in this and that, and just get through a couple of points of that are relevant to that audience. And then there's the cold open, where you just have some other thing where you just have a quick open where you get into something and then it gets into your intro. You have to know your audience. You have to know your show. How long is your show? That's another thing. You have a 2-hour long show, a 2-minute open's fine. You have a 10-minute long show, a 2-minute open is not so fine.
Yeah.
Right. So knowing that the format and everything else will dictate what you're going to do there. But it has to be something that you really feel is going to hook your audience. Yeah. And that's the content. If you can't figure that out,
I think this is really I think this is really exciting. It's just an opportunity to try different things at the end of the day, right? Like, you probably, that guy editing those intros, right? He was not the first try, right? He probably tried
sure, they're not
30 other things. So I encourage everybody that's creating, try something new. If what you create, like, you might not be getting the best feedback, try different styles and go back 2 minutes in this recording and then try what I was telling you.
Yeah, I think someone that has a really good intro that I would recommend people checking out is Creator Science. Jay Klaus, he's part of the HubSpot Podcast Network.
Yeah.
And he does really good intros. He takes like snippets, adds context and story to some of those snippets, and then it tells you in this episode, this is what you're going to learn today. And he gives you kind of like the little, bullet points / hooks. And at the end of that minute, you are invested, and he makes it a minute specifically, so then he can share in all short form platforms, right? Yeah, you can publish it there. I think is the way to go. Honestly, you definitely need to put intention into the hooks, and it brings me back to, I think it was David Ogilvy, right? Like, legendary copywriter. I think he said, out of every dollar you spend, your headline is worth like 90 cents, because that's what's going to determine whether people are going to consume, the next line and the next line and, potentially the rest of the piece.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with podcasting, right? And I'm going to be honest, calling us out right here. We've probably neglected a little bit. For a while, we neglected the hooks in a sense.
For a
right?
while,
we recorded
meaning like 300 episodes. Just saying.
Yeah, for a long time. Yeah, exactly. So we definitely, we've been picking it up. So, congrats. Let's go, team.
There we go.
we got the
Congrats.
That is. So, Rob, I got so many more things, but I don't want to keep you hostage from, your family in there. But I'm curious, in here, there's a
by the way, this is my day job, so you're not. I'm working. So.
Let's go.
This is gonna be a 3-part episode.
Yeah. I have 2 slides that really call my attention on this like myth part. One is guaranteed audience growth. Great content, it says better than bad marketing, and it also says bad content greater than great marketing, and then you have like an acronym at the bottom, WOMM. So how do you what does that mean? Because I would, from a no context guy, I would say that a podcast that has great marketing, right, probably gets more listeners than a content that, the bad content. But in here, you're putting like bad content is greater than great marketing.
I always try to equate podcasting as long form content, and it is very, very similar in how you're going to market approach as movies are done. And at the end of the day, movies that succeed, it's all about the WOMM, word of mouth marketing. Right? That is the best marketing. And so to the point of great content trumps bad marketing and bad content trumps great marketing, from that point of view, I give the perfect examples. Disney, 2 movies from Disney. One had a ton of marketing. One had no marketing. The one with a ton of marketing, they spent $200 million on the marketing on this movie. At the end of the day, it was like 95 million in ticket sales. The other one, they did no marketing, none. I mean, almost nothing. The whole budget for the movie, the actors, one big name actor, the whole budget was $40 million. And that movie made $625 million. Why? Because people that saw that movie said, you got to go see it. They told all their friends to go see it. And the other one, the people that saw it said, you do not go back. Do not go to that movie. And those movies are Lone Ranger and Sixth Sense.
Yeah.
And you probably saw Sixth Sense because someone told you to go see it.
Yeah.
And you probably didn't see Lone Ranger because you have a friend who told you do not go see that.
I was the guy saying do not go see Lone Ranger.
I'm going to get some heat, but I haven't seen none of those movies.
Sixth Sense, if you haven't seen Sixth Sense and it hasn't been spoiled for you yet, go see it.
Yeah.
It is one of the greatest movies, and when you get to the end, you're going to go, how did I miss that?
Yeah.
And you're going to go back and you're going to watch it again. But the point was, and Bruce Willis was in that movie, and that was most of the budget, right, for that movie.
So
but there was no marketing.
Yeah.
There was no marketing campaign, big marketing campaign. It was total budget with marketing, everything was $40 million, and it did $625. And the same thing works in podcasting. Yes, you know what? If you put a lot of marketing to a podcast, you're going to get the flywheel started. But the second you pull the marketing dollars away, the flywheel stops. And the audience, there's not an audience. It's people that were tricked by the marketing to go listen to this podcast that's really bad. I mean, there are some gimlet podcasts, I'm going to call them out, that are just absolutely horrendous, but they get audience downloads because the trailers are good and they're on all these other gimlet podcasts that then people go, oh, I should check it. But then they take away the marketing. What happens to those podcasts?
Yeah, I'll be interested to know like that retention, how many other episodes does that person that discovers that show, listen after that? I love this so much.
Yeah, this segment is really good.
One of our most commented, and we actually got DMs and like people messaging us from this clip is like the talent clip. We did a podcasting town hall here.
I wanted to dive into that.
And we talk about like how important is talent, and like not enough people talk about talent, like good talent or good content for a successful podcast. Everybody's talking about like the latest like marketing tactics, this thing like how to advertise your show. But at the end of the day, like if you are not good delivering the content, it is a skill that you need to develop, right? Like we've been doing our best to develop our skill, for 400 plus episodes. You have been doing it for years, right? At the end of the day, that's so important. So, and that goes across all platforms, right? And I heard an interview the other day about a couple of creators that are on YouTube. It's also so interesting because as we put content out there, right, like we're hopefully the best version of ourselves, the best version of that content, like the best thought process after that, but we're exposed. That's out in the world, right? And maybe a lot of people might be scared of that, but it's also wonderful because you receive feedback, and if we leave our ego aside, we can grab those experiences and continue to learn and level up, and then the people are going to continue to stay. So thank you for bringing that trust and talent. I think those two, like with the talent, you're going to be able to develop that trust with that listener. They're going to come back, right? They're going to listen. They're going to provide feedback. They're going to establish that communication with you, and then everybody wins.
I'm curious on your thoughts on talent, right? And I mentioned this because again, going back to word of mouth marketing and great content, bad marketing, all the pieces to the equation. When you were talking about Tim Ferriss and he wanted to grow his show, you asked him if he knew a celebrity, right? And he's like, yeah, of course, I know Arnold Schwarzenegger, can bring him on, awesome. And then, The Sixth Sense has Bruce Willis, which is, and I think at that point he was already pretty big of a star. How influential is an attractive character, right? Like that personality on a podcast, right? Of course, there has to be quality content for retention, but I'm curious how, and I'm asking this, I'm going to add context to this question, I guess. I'm thinking of somebody that they might not have such a big audience and they want to start a podcast and their goal is to, grow their audience, but they're saying, well, I'm not that personality at the moment. And I know it's a journey. You got to grow, you got to practice, right? You got to put the times in and the reps in. But I'm curious on how do you see it? Like what are the things that they can do to increase their perception as an attractive character in the eyes of the listeners?
One, you have to be committed to the content. I don't care how big a celebrity you are. If you're not committed, if you're just phoning it in, that podcast, the audience is going to hear that and they're going to see that and they're not going to come back. And I can tell you, we've had some A-list podcasters that were on Libsyn that was so excited that they were with us, and I thought their numbers would be huge. And when I went and looked at their numbers, they were getting 2,000 downloads an episode. And I'm like, oh my God. And these are people, if I would say their names, everybody would know who they are. So I'm not talking about people, maybe, and I always love when people dismiss Joe Rogan. Well, Joe Rogan, he got that big because people knew who he was. Really? There's a lot more celebrities out there that people knew of than Joe Rogan. Yeah. Joe got that big from being consistent and releasing the content on a regular basis, and that's how he got that big. And you can't, it's not just about celebrity. Celebrity status will get you that flywheel started, but if the content isn't there, it fades away. The people don't recommend it. And there have been podcasts that I would have been 100%. If you'd said to me, you got to bet on one of these two being successful, I would put all my money on the A-list celebrity, and it just never happened. And it was just shocking. But when I looked at why, and I did look at some of them, it was a phone-in job. There wasn't a real connection with the audience. It was like someone at their agency said, you need to do this, and I did it. And we're probably getting a few of those right now with the writer's strike and actors being free. There's some more that are coming out and doing podcasts. I'm sure some of those are phone-ins, and once the strike's over, they're going to back to what they did, and the podcast will go away.
Yeah.
Who's the talk show host? Strike Force or Strike all the Jimmys?
Strike Force 5.
Yeah, Strike Force 5.
We're gonna go from 400,000 and some more active podcast back to 400,000.
Which is great.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. It's there's definitely a lot of opportunities. So I'm curious in here. You have guaranteed downloads is not the same as your actual audience. People, earlier you said the first Walch law was, downloads equals ego squared. Mm-hmm. And this is something that, again, is across the industry. When you ask people about their show and how big it is, like they tell you, I'm on X amount of downloads. But I've always got this like icky feeling a little bit sometimes that it's like, well, I know my phone downloads a whole bunch of episodes of a whole bunch of podcasts that I have in there, but I don't necessarily listen to all those episodes or all those podcasts all the time. There's some in there that I probably, need to delete and, clear some memory. So,
yeah. Well, first off, the good news is Apple Podcasts pauses downloads if you go 5 episodes in 15 days without listening to that podcast. It will pause the downloads. So your numbers aren't getting artificially thrown off.
Unless there's like a download farm, somebody with a bunch of phones just like...
Yeah. But there are those services. And then, there's one service out there. This when I was talking about on the slide you're at, I was talking about this service. I won't name names, but it was one that iHeartRadio used, and it was a great article from Ashley Carmen about it. And it's called Loot Coin Marketing. And Loot Coin Marketing is where this company would, if you're playing an app and you're in the middle of an app and you want to get coins to use in the app to buy more bread for the zombie or whatever it is you're doing, to buy an outfit in Fortnite or whatever the thing is, you have to get paused out of that game. You're brought over and you listen to an episode, you listen to a podcast, a minute of a podcast. And then you go back and you collect the coins and you go back and do your game. And 0 of those listeners are going to come over and become listeners of your podcast. They're annoyed. They're annoyed that they had to go over. They were bribed to get the coins and to listen to that. And we looked at someone that used one of those services, and where they were before, they turned it on. Their numbers went way up because they're using the direct URL, which, by the way, will get you kicked out of almost any service that's putting ads in. And then they turned it off, and the audience dropped back to exactly where they were before. They got nothing out of it.
Wow.
Right.
So
and that's just common sense.
Yeah.
But they're guaranteeing audience. And there was one company that was guaranteeing 1 million downloads in 90 days for $999. And we could tell it wasn't real, and we could see where they were when they turned it on and where it was when they turned it off. Again, none of that audience stuck. It was all bogus. So we actually, on that service, when we approached them and they realized the jig was up, they closed their site down. I think it was called podcastpromotion.net.
Wow.
And so I only give the name out because you can go see the landing page is now a WordPress thing. But it was in a matter of a Monday finding out a podcast using it to by Thursday having the site closed down. That was like a great moment. You ask you ask what are some of the things I'm most proudest about. I probably should have put that one in there.
Yeah, that's so good.
In the achievements tab, this is what I've done.
Killing podcastpromotion.net. Yeah, I'll put that up there in my top 3.
If it's if it sounds too good to be true, it's definitely too good to be true. I mean, we dabble right with paid advertising. Like we've tried different things, and our own experience, we saw I think between 3% and 5% retention for like a cold traffic, and we're like, look, like we're gonna stop that. Like, I don't think like that's even the thing that we do, but we're just focusing on something else. Like, we want to word of mouth. Like, that's number one for us, is like people finding out and recommending somebody else, and that has been great. I think like the quality of the people that listen to your show matters so much. And then personally, I'm very impressed with the amount of episodes. Like, how consistent are you? Like, that says way more about you as an entrepreneur, as a content creator, than the total downloads that you might have on your show.
So,
go
ahead.
And I don't want your viewers, listeners to come out of this going, well, Rob from Libsyn said don't do any marketing. That's not what
exactly.
I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's not what I'm saying. You still need to market, right?
Yes, 100%.
But you have to do it right. You have to do the right marketing. You have to do marketing that matters. And in podcasting, what's marketing that matters? Well, the one that we've seen that has the best impact is marketing your podcast on another podcast in your genre. So if you are an MMA podcast, having your episode, having a takeover episode, which I hate, by the way, having a takeover episode on a true crime podcast or a knitting podcast is not going to work. You have to be in your same genre. Having a promo played as an ad on another MMA podcast or another podcast in the sports genre, right, that's geared towards men, that would be more likely to work. But you have to make sure it's smart. Another place you could market, Overcast app or Podcast Addict. There's banners, and you can pick the genre that you want. So you have business podcast, you can advertise your podcast in the business category. You don't want to advertise your business podcast in the history category or the true crime category. If you're a business podcast, you advertise in the business category.
Yeah, I like this. And Libsyn has an advertising platform, right? Yes. Where you guys sell ad space, and then podcasters also, they can put, mid-rolls and pre-rolls, everything, and then they also can get compensated, if I'm not mistaken. Correct. Perfect. And
approved.
Okay,
good.
So I'm curious, right? Because like we mentioned, we dabbed into paid advertising. This is where I believe was our mistake. We just took some of the episodes that we believe, that had good numbers previously to paid advertising, and they had some big people in there that were recognizable by people in the industry, and then we just ran advertising to it. First mistake is I feel like there was no cadence on how do we hook people from one episode to go to the next episode. It was just like a standalone episode. Second mistake, which now after a conversation it might be actually number one mistake, was not focusing enough on the first 30 seconds to 1 minute of our show, right? So we could hook people and get them invested into listening more. So the retention that we saw was under our own conclusion, a little bit low. The company that we were using, they were saying that was actually a fair number, a normal number. Now I'm curious, based on, Libsyn, what you've seen with other shows, what are some of the best practices? Let's say we are going to dab again into paid advertising. And how can we make it count? And maybe what are some, I know this might change depending on the niche and whatnot, but what are some, standards, right, that we should look into? What are some numbers that we can use as a reference and be like, okay, this was a successful campaign, yes or no?
Okay, so first thing is, if you're going to advertise on other podcasts, there's going to be a couple different ways that you're going to do that. One, if you can, the best way is to get it be a host-read ad. So that the host is reading off some bullet points that you've put together to talk about your podcast. It's in the voice that the podcast listener is used to, and it brings an air of authority to it. So first, being able to get that other podcaster in your genre to do the talking point read, that's key. And it could be the faked in ad where it's in one episode. It can be across their whole category where they do a DAI and stitch it across the whole run of the show, all episodes. Yeah. But either way, getting that recording in their voice is key if you can get that. Now, you can't get that with all, right? If you happen to be in a genre where there's some really big podcasts and they're repurposed content, it comes from radio, you're not going to get that host to do the read.
Yeah.
In that case, you have to have a good 30 and a good 60 second and a good 90 second promos. Now you might say, Rob, 90-second ad? People put the ads a lot of times when they're advertising in the wrong place. Do you want your ad to run in the pre-roll or the mid-roll or the post-roll of a show? And if you say pre-roll and it's on a 90-minute or an hour and a half long which is an hour and a half long or 2 hour long podcast, you have to hope they remembered that. You put it in the post-roll. You're not going to get as many people listening in the post-roll, but when they are listening in the post-roll, it's the post-roll. And guess what? They need another podcast to go listen to. And what did they just hear? You. And if you're lucky, they heard your podcast from the host. But even if it's not the host, it's your nice 90-second promo. And guess what? People will allow you to put a 90-second promo at the end of their podcast because they're like, oh, who cares? It's the end of my podcast. I don't care. Whatever. But that's the best time to catch them. Too many times people are advertising on other podcasts or putting it in the pre-roll. That's the worst place to put an ad. Mid-roll is better. Pre-roll, advertising another podcast, horrible, because no one's going to stop listening to that podcast at that point and go and listen. And I can tell you what, I'm Mr. Shiny Thing, and 90 minutes later, I don't remember that ad at the beginning. Yeah. Maybe I'll remember it later, and now I have to remember where it was that I was supposed to go.
But also, you skip it, right? Sometimes, like the shows that I know, I know like, for the first 30 minutes, 60 seconds, I'm just gonna skip. It's pure ad.
Overcast app, automatically you can set it up to skip the first 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of an episode. Every episode you go to listen to, it automatically skips. So savvy podcast listeners already skip in the beginning. So getting it in the mid-roll is the best place, if you can't do the post-roll. But again, advertising a podcast in the post-roll is personally, you pay less. Guess what? If you're paying less, you can run more ads and get a better ROI.
Yeah. And you're probably getting people, again, that are consuming a lot of, the full episode, right? They're consumers. They're not kind of like jumping around.
I listen all the way through the end of All In, right? When I listen I'm on the tractor riding my mower, I'm listening all the way through. It's only when it stops playing and I'm like, now I got to pull the phone out. Now I got to go listen.
What's the next one?
But if there was an ad that ran at the end for something that I thought was actually interesting, well, I'm picking the phone up anyway. Let me search for that. Okay, I'll give it a try.
So good.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some benchmarks for those people that are looking to? And I know,
I don't want to. I hate giving numbers.
Okay, no worries then.
No. Here's the reason why I hate giving numbers. It really is dependent on the topic and the size of the show. A comedy podcast, what do you expect the ROI to be on that, or the retention, versus a podcast that's about pneumatic valves that you put on another podcast? Guess what? If it's really niche-based, the numbers go up. If it's very generic, history, true crime, comedy, even many business podcasts, the numbers, the conversions are going to be lower than if it's a niche-orientated podcast.
Yeah. By the way, every time somebody asks us, like, how send us some examples of your content, because everybody likes content different ways on how they look, how they sound, whatever. But
yeah, real quick
I'm talking
to the benchmarks part on the numbers.
Is the feedback on that?
Here's the best answer on benchmarks. Measure against campaigns you run for your show, against other campaigns you run for your show. Don't measure about what other people did. Run 3, 4, 5. Don't just buy ad campaigns from Libsyn. Buy ad campaigns from Wondery. Buy ad campaigns from whoever else you're going to buy from, and see how those different campaigns ran against each other. Do Overcast versus Podcast Addict versus Spotify. And I can tell you, I've done that. I've run Overcast and Podcast Addict and Spotify, and it's in that order. Overcast, I got a much better conversion rate than I got with Podcast Addict, and then I got with Spotify. But I will preface it with these criteria. I was doing that looking at a tech podcast and a business podcast. And guess what? Overcast is always going to be better on tech podcast than any other app out there because it's a tech-oriented audience. And I was also a very iOS. It's iOS app, so it's an iOS audience. So I had a podcast today in iOS. Shocker, that did better on Overcast than it did on Spotify. Spotify was unmeasurable. It was so bad for me.
Yeah.
But I have heard people that have done podcasts that are about like Real Housewives and geared towards women between 21 and 35 that have done really well in Spotify. So run campaigns multiple places, measure your campaigns against each other. That's how you get your benchmark.
Absolutely. And
that's what I was going to say, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, lately we've been talking a lot about the hypothesis, like inside of your own thing, right? Like what's the hypothesis that you want to test it out for whatever time you want to test it out, and then do the same thing for the other platforms. So I love how you broke it down in the podcasting world, man. Thank you.
It's a
masterclass.
Real quick, is setting like you said, setting those benchmarks yourself, and then the goal becomes, okay, how can I improve this? How can I make this 1% better? And then it's a scientific method, right? Like you have your hypotheses, you test it, right? And then you see whether it gives you the result, yes or no. Yes, do more of the same. No, okay, what are we going to change next, right? And then you repeat that process. And I probably butchered the scientific method right there, but
Never hire a marketing company that's going to market the direct URL of your episode, because that's going to cause bogus numbers that'll get you kicked out of a lot of places, but it's also going to be artificial and it's not real measurable. It's not real audience. And never measure for a company that's marketing to a web page that has a player that when you land there, the player auto plays or could autoplay. So make sure when you're doing any marketing that you're sending people to a place where they have to take an action. They have to click on something to do something. And so that is one of the key things I recommend. And again, some of it can be where they don't even send them to somewhere. If they hear it on another podcast, now the listener has to go and search for it. So then in that case, make sure you have a great, clear call to action. Your call to action has to be repeated a couple times. And if people are listening to it on a podcast, it has to be understandable and easy to spell. And if you have something like yours is great, content is profit. You know what? If they can't spell that, they don't deserve to listen to the show. But there are other shows like the Amateur Traveler podcast. I can't spell amateur. I cannot spell amateur. I still to this day can't spell amateur. I never get it right. I have known Chris for 18 years. I still can't spell amateur.
That's awesome.
What do you say to people that they're listening? Because this all makes sense to me. I agree 100%. But I know there's gonna be people who are like, this sounds like way too much work. Is a pain. Like I want the numbers. Like I want that thing. I want that. Right.
It is work.
It is work. It's absolutely. I always joke. There's two areas where people pod fade. We see pod fading means that you start a podcast and then you stopped.
Yes.
One of them is before 10 episodes. Right? Why before 10 episodes? Because they realize early on that this is hard work. Whoa, wait a second. This isn't as easy as just putting a blog together. And now with ChatGPT, I can just have it write my blogs for me. What am I doing this thing for? So that group pod fades within 10 episodes. That's basically almost 90% of your Anchor audience, right? The people that are host on Anchor. That's that group. Then you've got the other group that pod fade at 50 episodes. And the answer is why 50? Because they made a commitment they were going to do it for a year. And when they get to that year mark, they realize they didn't grow an audience.
Done.
And that's the ones that, what did they do wrong? What did you do wrong? Were their expectations wrong? I mean, I've had people say to me 2 months into a podcast, I've got 1,200 listeners per episode. What am I doing wrong? And I'm like, whoa, that's really good. What's your show about? And get into it. And then they realize that, hey, 1,200 is much better than the median. In the presentation, I have median and mean numbers. The median number is about 136. Half the podcasts out there get less than 136 downloads per episode in the first 30 days.
Perspective,
Yeah, so you have to look at that.
That's amazing.
That's impressive. I do have a hypothesis I want to bounce off of you, off of your wisdom. Let's say we're going to run ads, right? And I want to use this episode based on, I'm going to kind of like build this hypothesis based on what you've shared with us today too. So I want, obviously, people take them somewhere where they have to take an action. And this is part of my direct response brain talking a little bit as well. So let's say I take them to a landing page and the promise is, you're going to get a master class on podcasting and we're going to break this episode that we just recorded in 3 different parts so I can serve them one episode at a time on their email, right? Every time they sign up. Now we run an ad. Let's say we have an awesome hook, and we have, we have an awesome hook. Do you think that would be a valuable campaign based off your experience? And I'm bouncing this hypothesis because if you say yes, we're doing this.
Again, it depends on your audience. And, again, if your audience is for content creators, yeah. I hope people that listen to this gather some nuggets that will help them. Absolutely. And I hope there's some people that listen to this and go, you know what, I'm done. I'm not going to do this anymore. This is way too much work. And, I have other things I need to spend my life on doing because this isn't for me. I can't put the work in. Yeah. And I hope there's someone that makes that decision because better now than later. Better, Absolutely. Get out the people that quit before episode 10, you should be envious of if you're the one that's going to quit at 50. Because they spent the rest of their year doing something else that hopefully was productive for them. Yeah. Content creation is not for everyone. It is hard work. Yeah. And you have to want to do it, and you have to love doing it, and you have to be committed to doing it. Yeah. And if you are, and as I said, you're one of 400,000 podcasters. That's a small number compared to the 757 million blogs out there and the 500 million podcasts YouTubes that are out there. Yeah. You're in a much smaller niche. And if you can do this and you want to do this, you can be very successful at this. It's not too late to get into podcasting in any way, shape, or form. Yeah,
I'm gonna take that as a yes, bro. And I love what you're saying. I like the fact we're gonna have to create some shirts. One that says 400,000 strong, equally encouraging people to podcast as to make them quit podcasting.
Share or book cover. Pick one.
It's gonna be a shirt with a whole paragraph in there.
400. Just think about this: 400,000 people is 4 home games for University of Michigan.
Yeah.
That's it.
Crazy.
That's it.
Yeah.
Or Nebraska volleyball team, which is crazy.
They just broke that record. Yeah. Pretty impressive.
Dude, that's crazy. This has been awesome. I don't know. Do you have any other questions? I know that you can talk about for the
we can talk forever. But we'll definitely bring you on. Let's say after the next podcast movement,
we'll make it a tradition.
And if you're okay with that, we can definitely make it a tradition. Bring you on once a year, or maybe more often if you're okay with that. So we gotta bring you in person to the studio. That'll be pretty cool.
Where's your studio at?
We're in Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully,
hopefully Hurricane Lee makes a right turn here some point.
Yes, I was listening to that. There's another hurricane coming from sea.
Thank you for the notice.
Yeah. By the way, fun fact: last week my wife was on a cruise, left me with the 2 kids. The 2 kids got sick, and we got a hurricane coming. So I had to secure the trampoline while all this was happening. So I'm an expert now on securing trampolines
on hurricanes.
I'm prepared.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely bring you on when there's no hurricanes around.
No hurricanes.
Hurricanes.
Good job, fun. Your English today.
It's okay.
Beautiful.
It's okay.
Bellissimo. Rob, last question that we literally ask every single guest. This has been a treat. This has been awesome. We're so fortunate to have you on the show, and everybody listening. This is a treat. This is a masterclass. Save this episode. If you want it, if you want the content, send us a DM. We'll send it to you. And where will you be if you never published?
Where would I be if I'd never published podcasting, if I'd never gotten into content marketing? I was working in the quartz crystal oscillator field. And I would probably be in some company selling electronic components somewhere and miserable at this point, for sure. Because I wouldn't have been in the quartz crystal oscillator industry anymore, because that industry just imploded after I got out. I saw that coming. But it's that I was an electrical engineer, and I spent many years designing, and then ultimately in sales and marketing in electronic industry, selling quartz crystal oscillators, which almost nobody listening has any idea what they are.
Yeah, I was gonna say I have no. It sounds awesome. Sounds super cool.
Sounds like a Discovery Channel show.
Yeah, I was like, sounds super cool until you said that you would be miserable. Then I was like, it's probably then not that cool. That's probably why they named it cool.
It was interesting when I was designing it, but the selling going in selling in the component industry, it just became so commoditized.
Yeah.
Because of what's happened, all the manufacturing that moved overseas that used to be in the U.S. I would not have been happy selling overseas manufactured product. I liked when it was manufactured here.
Yeah, probably still in Erie. Your wife not happy because you guys didn't move to Kansas?
The company that I left in Erie is still there.
Okay.
We would not be in Erie anymore. No, I wouldn't be married if we were. If I was, yeah.
Well, Rob, we are grateful you took the leap and went for podcasting. And after all these years, I'm grateful we managed to connect. And hopefully, the beginning of an awesome friendship and relationship. That's what I say all the time after the podcast. Like, man, I love podcasting. We just get to meet some awesome people and build some great relationships. And again, on the podcast town hall episode that we did, that's what I said. I was like, I like podcasting because I get to make cool friends. So, Rob, thank you so much. Hopefully, you consider us some cool friends.
Like, no pressure now.
Absolutely. I had a lot of fun. So please, I'd love to come back on. And I'll give this, to your listeners, if they want a copy of the slide deck that you kept mentioning, you can email me, rob@libsyn.com or rob@podcast411.com, either way. And just tell me you listened on the show, and I will not add you to a mailing list. I will not put you in a mailing list. I just promise you that right now. But email me, say you want the slide deck that Luis was talking about, and I will get that out to you.
Yes, and you want that slide that you're saying.
Yeah, it's really good.
Bizarre verified.
We in the best way possible, we milk last year's for content. Like, we talked about it so many times. We referred to it so many times. Yeah. It was an incredible resource. So thank you so much for that.
Rob, thank you again. Is there anything that you want to say before we head out?
No, have a great weekend. I'd say go Chiefs, but we lost last night.
I'm guessing that's like an American football reference.
Yeah.
Go Jags. No, I'm kidding.
Go Arsenal.
Hey, the Jags are going to have a good season. You got a good quarterback. You guys are going to have a good season.
I became a fan last season when we won against the Chargers. It was like the one game I went to and became a fan. Just saying. So go Jags, Duval.
It's never too late to become a fan.
It's never too late. Anyways, with that said, guys, thank you so much for tuning to the Contents Profit Podcast. Go ahead and follow the show in your favorite podcasting platform and on social media at BizRosCo.
That is right on it. Rob here, help you move one step closer towards your goal. Please don't forget to share this episode and leave a 5-star review. See ya.
Bye, guys.